Hey, welcome back and thanks for joining me. Today on Talking Tuesday, we're going to talk a little bit about clubs. This is a tough subject for me because it's pretty complicated. I'm not out to offend anybody. I really don't know what I'm talking about, and I've tried to write about it. I've thought about vlogging about it, and every time I get into it, I end up thinking, who cares what I think? It doesn't matter. But you know, it's not the first time on this channel that I've spouted stuff that really doesn't matter, and it's just my opinion. I think part of my problem in approaching this before was that I always tried to do it in one sitting, and it's really kind of a complicated subject. There's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to try and avoid doing that this time. We'll break it up into sections and just hit different areas and we'll see where it goes. Before anybody says, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's fill in the blanks. I'll just admit up front, I don't know what I'm talking about. Now, I've read a lot about various clubs from the 30s up to now. I'd like to think I'm a pretty objective reader. I tend not to read books written by people who were kicked out or people who infiltrated such and such a club. I think there's too much of a financial incentive to overblow the facts or overemphasize what really happened. You know, nobody's gonna buy a book that talks about how you infiltrated such and such a motorcycle gang, only to find out that nothing really happened and that nothing was going on. At the same time, I'm not super naive. People are people no matter where you go, regardless of what patches or regardless of what uniform or regardless of what company they work for. There's good people and there's bad people. So I really try and have a balanced picture of what it's all about. But I have read a lot of the stories about clubs coming up in the 30s, the 40s, 60s, 70s, when a lot of influential clubs were starting up. I have tried to build a fairly balanced impression of what the truth really is. So what we're going to do in a couple of videos is go over just my thoughts on clubs, what they are, who should be joining them, what clubs are out there, whether or not clubs are for you, or me. So I'm just talking in general and from an outsider's perspective. You know, all kinds of people walk around and say, you want to watch out for such and such a club. But I've found through my interaction that most people in clubs, and most bikers really, will tend to give you a lot of space if you're just honest. Don't pretend that you're something you're not, and just be straight up. Treat people with respect like you'd want to be treated, and 9.5 times out of 10, that respect will be returned. You know, there's an old saying that respect is earned. Personally, I think that's kind of backwards. I will give somebody respect off the bat. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I have to assume that they are a man or a woman who deserves that respect. Now, if they prove me otherwise, they can lose that respect. But everybody starts off, you treat them like people. So I'm not going out of my way to upset anybody or to speak out of turn or give away any secrets or anything like that. We're just talking about it. And I would ask, although you're certainly free to state your opinions, I would just ask that you be a little respectful in the comments as well. Just because I don't want this all to turn into a big shouting match and name calling and everything else, because that doesn't accomplish anything. It's just noise. So we're going to touch on a couple of things. We're going to touch on history. Now, my opinion of clubs is that it really should be built on a relationship. Now, if I could hang out with a bunch of guys or women who are all about motorcycles, that just want to ride, that just want to go faster, further, and more, that would be ideal for me. And as far as I'm concerned, if they can bring their own personalities and foibles with them and all that stuff that makes them them, that adds richness. Let's break down really the two kinds of motorcycle clubs. There are motorcycle clubs, or MCs, and there are riding clubs, or RCs. Motorcycle clubs, a lot more organized, a lot more structured, lots of rules from everything that I've heard. You know, they are the ones that generally have a hang-around period, a prospecting period, some have a probationary period. Not only is every club different, but every chapter may also be slightly different and operate a little bit differently. And that's true of MCs, RCs, what have you. RCs, riding clubs, tend to be a little bit looser. There's a lot of riding clubs for different brands and things like that. If you're a Yamaha V-Star rider, you may be part of a Star Riders group. Obviously, Honda Goldwings have their own group. And of course, everybody knows about the Harley Owners group. And those are all pretty much riding clubs. Some are sponsored by dealerships. There are law enforcement clubs, firemen clubs, military clubs. There are religious clubs, motorcycle ministry clubs. There's pretty much a riding club for anything you want to be associated with. I don't know, is there a Toyota owners riding club? I don't know. Wouldn't shock me. I mean, there's riding clubs that center around being from Brooklyn. There's riding clubs that center around being conservationists. If you're a left-handed, one-armed Haitian, there's probably a riding club for you. So there's this intermeshing of a lot of these groups, but for the most part, if you're going to divide it up into, well, really 3 groups. You've got motorcycle clubs, riding clubs, which tend to be a little bit looser. You can come and go as you want. They don't generally have as many rules and as much structure. Most of the time you can buy your way into them. That is absolutely not true of most motorcycle clubs. Riding clubs, you can kind of buy your way into most of them. And then you've got independents who aren't in any of these clubs. And they're just riding around doing their thing. So that's a real broad description of the 3 different types. Now, if we go back into the history of all this, from everything I've read, it started out in the very early beginning as bicycle clubs. Bicycle clubs were pretty hip. And then somebody decided they were going to put a motor on this bicycle. It was shortly after that that motorcycle clubs per se were born. Some of the clubs that morphed from bicycle clubs into motorcycle clubs were like the Yonkers Bicycle and Motorcycle Club. They were formed sometime in the 1800s. You get the Portsmouth Motorcycle Club that was formed in 1893. A lot of clubs out west, like the San Francisco Motorcycle Club, which was formed, I think, in 1903 or 1904. And the Oakland MC, which was formed in 1907. All these really super early clubs. Anything with a motor on it is going to have racing. So they started racing these things and doing enduros and stuff like that. The Oakland MC is still around. And from what I've seen, they'll take anything on a motorcycle. They're not brand specific. Unlike a lot of what we think of as motorcycle clubs, where they'll insist on, Harley Davidsons or maybe Indians or something like that, generally American-made motorcycles. And I heard some chapters require Harley Davidsons, but it wasn't always like that. So around the turn of the century, these motorcycle clubs, a lot of them became affiliated with the Federation of International Motorcyclists, or the FIM, which later morphed into the AMA, or the American Motorcycle Association. But they would hold meets and races and that kind of thing, gypsy tours all over the place, and everybody would bring their motorcycle and have a good time, and they'd do motorcycle things. And that was pretty typical for a lot of these early clubs. And in the process of going to these different races and meets and things like that, a lot of them would come out and make their own jackets. They'd show up in all the same jacket to be part of a team. Hey, this is our team and we're representing. So a lot of the patches and jackets and that kind of thing started taking hold there. And all of that led into the Hollister riot. Most people will say that Hollister was really a bunch of guys just having fun, and this was their gypsy tour that they came on, and they did racing and there was drinking and there was partying, but the town didn't get burnt down. It didn't get taken over, according to most reports, including some of the law enforcement. There were comparatively few fights that weekend. It was just, there was a little bit of drunken brawling, but this was also back in the day when if you got in a drunken brawl, you spent the night in jail, you got out the next day and you went on your way. Maybe you paid a fine, but it wasn't a felony. So it was significantly different. And a lot of the stories that happened during Hollister were sensationalized. And that's been happening for decades. It started there and the news found out, hey, this really works, this sells. So anyways, this is how we get the gypsy tours. And it was around that point, or maybe sometime after that, that the American Motorcycle Association, in order to distance them from this outlaw scourge, had come out with the comment that 99% of motorcyclists are law-abiding citizens and 1% are troublemaker ne'er-do-wells. And what that seemed to mean at the time was they're not following our rules. Well, obviously, the outlaw biker world grabbed onto that and ran with it further down the road. But I mean, that's kind of where it all came from. It wasn't necessarily like any of those guys in Hollister were growing meth or anything like that. So most of them had jobs, a good number of them. And this seems to happen every time we have a war. A lot of vets come back and they miss the camaraderie of having that team that they had in a wartime situation. Some of them really like the adrenaline. It can be a very mundane place when you come back from a battlefield situation. So they gravitated towards these groups where they had shared experiences. A lot of them were wartime vets. And this has happened from World War I, World War II, obviously Vietnam. I mean, every conflict that we've had, motorcycle club membership has grown. And a lot of people think of, oh, outlaw bikers, but a lot of those outlaw bikers are vets, ex-vets, and vets that fought for the country. Now, I have to say I'm a little in awe of these early groups because it was really before a lot of the rigidity in politics that seemed to be the case now. Now, does that mean that history has made it more romantic than it was? Maybe. I don't know. I wasn't there. You know, were some of these wartime vets that just were solid, great American guys out having fun with the boys? Were they really assholes? I don't know. I didn't know them. But I will say that those early clubs very much formed an image in my mind of what I would want a club to be. I'm not anti-club at all. As a matter of fact, I view a lot of them with a little bit of awe. Somebody rides by with that patch, and I have some idea of what they had to do to get that patch, some idea of what they had to go through, the prospecting period and the work that went into it. And that's another reason why, if you're going to blast me in the comments below because I said something bad about your club, well, that's not true. I'm not anti-club at all. As a matter of fact, anybody that I've ever talked to or interacted with from large clubs, and there's been a couple of them, have always treated me very respectfully, very kindly, and really just exceptionally well. And I think that kind of behavior is very much part of the discipline of being in a larger club. I have respect for that as well. I have a little bit of awe of that, really. With that kind of history of wartime veterans coming back and joining groups and forming groups, it's not hard to understand how the whole prospecting process came about, because if you're in a shared experience, and it's usually hardship, prospecting is basic training. It's very similar to basic training. And that builds a cohesive bond, a bond between you and the people who have already made it. So it's not hard to see a connection between the military history of motorcycle clubs and how they do business today, and how they've done business for decades now. You know, what some people may call hazing actually has a purpose. And my understanding, and I read this, so again, I'm not giving out any secrets. Now, there's all kinds of horror stories about what people had to go through to be patched into a club. But my understanding, and I read this someplace, so take it with a grain of salt, most major clubs don't condone humiliating their prospects. They may work them like dogs, but nothing that's dehumanizing or humiliating to them, because eventually that's going to be a brother. Now, I'm sure when these early clubs started, there wasn't the kind of rigidity that there is now. I can't say for sure because I'm not 120 years old, but it doesn't seem that they had the same kind of rules about who can talk to who and who can hang out and associate with who and that kind of thing. If you didn't want to be there, get out. I haven't read any of that history anywhere that said that was the case. So clearly it's morphed through the decades. Now, what has it turned into? Again, I can't tell you because I don't know. I know what I'd like it to be. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know that it's not the case. I don't know. But we're going to continue this talk. In the next Club Talk episode, we'll take on, I don't know what we'll take on, but we'll take on something. We'll continue this discussion. Thank you again for joining me. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you next time. Bye.